Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's a real privilege to welcome you here for our discussion of the future of science and environmental journalism. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I'm fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the center. With a few new faces, I have to tell you that you're sitting actually at the formal memorial to Wilson. For better or worse, Wilson was our only president who had a PhD. And so Congress in 1968 saw fit to set up, instead of an obelisk on the mall that we go get our pictures taken in front of as tourists, a living memorial where these worlds of scholarship, policy, and practice could come together in dialogue and hopefully improve their respective endeavors. And so that's what we're doing today, and we really appreciate the opportunity to take advantage, frankly, of a big part of what the center is about, which is having scholars in residence. And so Peter Dykstra has been here for 2 months, and when CNN in its infinite wisdom decided that science and environment were topics that they weren't going to cover in any serious fashion, their loss was our gain. And so it's been really tremendous to work with Peter in putting today's program together and really having a whole series of conversations that are helping us here at the Wilson Center, and by today's meeting, helping you navigate this future of science and environment journalism. I should say a few words of introduction. One is to say that we've been very pleased. We've had a couple partnerships in trying to wrap our arms around these issues that have been very helpful to us, and we anticipate being very helpful in the future. One is with the International Reporting Project. Louise Leaf is here from that program, and just as an advertisement, on February 26th, we're going to have a Reporting from Uganda U.S. media covering health, environment, and security, reporting from an editor's trip where they took 3 senior editors to Uganda to look at these issues, and we'll try to have some of the lessons learned for how folks like our panelists today can convince the editors to actually print or publish or put on TV and radio the stories that they can so ably tell. The other is the Society of Environmental Journalists. If you are a journalist and you're interested in environment and you're not part of SEJ, you're really missing out. They've been tremendously helpful to us in learning and about this field. And so I commend to you their annual conference and membership, because it's really been something that's helped us a great deal.
Excuse me.
What we're trying to do today is 2 things. One, to understand how the changing topics and the field of what are the science topics and the environment topics. There's been a lot of change on the science side, and how that is affecting what and how it's being covered. And so we have some new stuff to look at, and it's moving rapidly, and that's not just a change of administration, although that's obviously a big issue, but some real big fundamental changes in the science that need to be covered. And so we have both Seth Borenstein and Liz Shogren, who are on the front lines of trying to cover those stories, to share their reflections on that. And then we're also trying to, as you might have noticed, there's been some big changes in the media and journalism period, and try to understand, with both Jan Schaffer and Peter Dykstra, helping us understand where we may be going, and in the context of those changes, some real, well, we'll try to have some good news, but some real challenges, we'll say, in the evolution of journalism and media itself. It's our practice here to be very brief on the introductions, because we hand out the paragraph. But we're going to start with Seth Borenstein, who, as you know, is a national science writer for Associated Press, won a number of awards for his coverage of environment, and someone who really is on the front line of covering so many of these stories. Elizabeth Schogren, whose voice, of course, we'll recognize, and then for some we now get to see what she looks like from National Public Radio covering these issues. It's really a great pleasure that she will be able to come and share some of her insights from her work on climate in particular, but the broad range of environment and energy on science issues. Jan Schaffer is Executive Director of the J-Lab, which is the Institute for Interactive Journalism, helping journalists understand, in some ways, make a transition into the digital world, for others to pursue that farther, and really looking forward to her helping us understand where we're going. And her experience, the Philadelphia Inquirer and Pulitzer Prize winner, really somebody who has worked on all sides of these issues, so it's tremendous to have her. And then, as I mentioned, Peter Dykstra, who we've been very lucky to have as a partner and here in-house. Was the head of the Science Environment Unit at CNN, worked there, I think, 17 years. Now is a regular writer for a new online environmental website that I commend to you, mnn.com, Mother Nature News, where he's writing literally 3 columns a week. For those who write a lot and write often and write quickly, Peter's putting some very good content on there that I will urge you to take a look at. We're going to start with Seth and turn the floor over to him. One final note, just because there's a special exhibit I want you all, when we're finished, down on the 4th floor, photographer Dave Hawkhurst, who's here, has a wonderful set of images of environments and development in Africa. I hope you'll check that out on your way out. So Seth, can I turn the floor over to you, and I'll make a switch here on the slides.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. For those of us who cover the environment, there's a familiar, you see symptoms of certain things, change, forcing habit, localized extinction, habitats are changing rapidly, it's anthropogenic, evolutionary changes are being forced more rapidly, changes in natural timing, and an issue that the public doesn't really notice. But this one is not climate change. It's what's happened to those of us who are covering it and other science issues. There are, as Jeff alluded to, dramatic changes. If you think about what's happening to the economy in general, the journalism business is like Detroit. We get it worse. We're getting it worse. We're getting it faster. And it's truly depressing. I think we're seeing reporters, editors, and management flunkies like Peter, who kind of covered climate change and science and environment, are being laid off. And this really does matter because if there are fewer voices, there are fewer people telling you what's going on, you're not going to get the news or as good a version of the news. But it's not just the national people like Peter. In 1 week, 3 friends who covered the science environment beat were laid off. Here from a Society of Environmental Journalists convention is a picture of Bruce Ritchie, formerly of the Tallahassee Democrats, and I guess it's my turn to make a pitch for SEJ. If you're very interested, the past president, Tim Wheeler, is right there in the 3rd row. Bruce covered the environment for a long period of time. Then they consolidated beats, so he's supposed to cover the environment and local government, and then they decided they didn't really need either of those, and he was laid off. It's not really the environment, just the environment. Ooh, something disappeared here. This is Craig Couvreux, who doesn't cover the environment. He covers space. He was the dean of space reporters. I had a couple years where I was covering nothing but the space program for the Orlando Sentinel. And Craig was the reporter for Aviation Week and Space Technology. 37 years he covered the space beat, mostly for Av Week. The man covered Apollo. Some of the people who were covering the space program when I was there weren't even born when he started. And he's always probably the smartest and one of the most plugged-in people. He was laid off last December from Av Week, which decided Aviation Week and Space Technology didn't really need a space reporter, at least not one based in Cape Canaveral. Luckily, Craig has now joined on to Spaceflight Now, so if you're looking, he's got good stories there. Boy, all my words have disappeared suddenly in this. Next to go, this is a Seattle Post-Intelligencer. There's a joint operating agreement between the PI and the Seattle Times. It's sort of a game of chicken on which one will die. Maybe both, but I tend to doubt that. The interesting things about Seattle and environment and science coverage is in most major cities, you're lucky if you have one reporter covering environment. Seattle Post-Intelligencer, you have a team of 2 very able environment reporters, And at the Seattle Times, you have a whole team. Both papers also have science reporters, which is unusual these days. Some of them will not be there. So what happens when you lose people like Peter Dykstra or Bruce Ritchie? This is from the Observatory at Columbia Journalism Review, which is one of a couple places that does a good job tracking, along with Night Science Journalism, tracking science journalism. And this was, obviously, December 15th. This is from Paul Rayburn, who's a former AP. I switched to CNN and found this about this new source of power made from water, a form of salt, and other common materials. Poppy Harlow, you've got to love that name, a business correspondent for CNN, cheerily recounted the good news. She quoted the inventor saying the mixture produces a chemical reaction 200 times more powerful than gasoline, and the discovery is on the scale of fire. The caveat, many scientists say the technology violates the basic laws of quantum physics. Harlow said these words, but they didn't seem to register with her. She might as well have said the only problem, it leaves a little lint in your pockets. Surely the timing of the story had nothing to do with CNN's recent announcement that it is eliminating its entire science and technology unit and laying off, among others, science correspondent Miles O'Brien. A Google search would have shown Harlow that the technology in question, produced by Blacklight Power of Cranberry, New Jersey, has been strenuously debunked by, among others, Robert Park at the University of Maryland. Robert Park, if you ever want to check the physics of something, Robert Park is a professional debunker. And according to Park, Blacklight was unable to get a U.S. patent for its research, and earlier this year was denied 4 patents in the United Kingdom. Lacking patents and independent confirmation of its finding, the company is, quote, is therefore dependent on investors with deep pockets and shallow brains. But if you don't know science, you don't know who to turn to. So this is, there really is a big difference in what's happened in the past year. Curtis Brainerd at Columbia Journalism Review was working on a cover story for the actual magazine, not even the website, on what's happening with science journalism, and there was a Harvard study saying it's going down. And when he talked to me, I guess it was the summer of last year, I was going, no, science journalism is doing probably better than much others in journalism. I pointed to John Noble Wilford and Larry Altman at the Times, and Warren Leary at the Times, and Robert Boyd at McClatchy, David Perlman at San Francisco Chronicle. What you'll find is with all these gentlemen, I think they're all, well, not Warren, in their 70s or above, maybe not Larry Altman, but they showed, the newspapers recognized that smart, intelligent, experienced science and medical writers were worthwhile, and they only get better. Now, actually, Curtis didn't finish that story, thank God. I called him up last December saying, please, if you're going to write it, let me, I've changed everything, please let me tell you what I think now. I don't believe any of that anymore. I think we're in as deep, if not more, trouble. Wilford is, John Noble Wilford, I believe, took the buyout, is doing part-time stuff there. Larry Altman left. Warren Leary left. Right there, in just those 3 at the Times, you lose an incredible amount of knowledge. There are hotspots and for new and niche hotspots for this reporting. Because somehow all my words have disappeared off my PowerPoint presentation, this is where I was mentioning E&E publications on the right-hand side. They are expanding where the rest of us are shrinking, opening up bureaus. And Climate Wire, I highly recommend. John Fialka, the editor of Climate Wire, is right there. That's showing that niche publication, if you're looking at these, and on the web, Mother Nature Network, where Peter is, those places are growing. The trouble is you're not getting, when you're looking at niches, you're not getting the broad picture you get from a John Noble Wilford or a Warren Leary. So, to stop gazing at our own navels, talk about the coverage now that Washington has changed. So let's look at EPA. Coverage of EPA will change because it's always dictated by who you cover. In some ways, it's going to be easier and tougher. During the Bush administration, when they are changing or what many would consider rolling back environmental rules, reducing enforcement, those were good enterprise stories, ripe for the picking, sort of low-lying, hanging fruit. when an administration is producing a lot of different initiatives, rolling out this and some new program after another every week, it kind of reduces the time to do stories like that. So if the Obama administration does that, sort of like the last few years of the Clinton administration, when they were trying to pull things together at the last minute, you don't have as much time to do some of that enterprise story. So it's easier because you're just writing like that, but you don't get to do the fun enterprise stories. And that's the tougher part. Also, you've got shrinking staff. There are fewer of you. You've got to do more work. So you're not going to get as much time to write about things. Some of the things I got to do in the past, I got to do stories about reduced environmental enforcement, reduced Superfund work, and the changing value of human life that the EPA had. Those are things you can do when you have a little more time, when an EPA is a little more quiet, some would call something else. But there's going to be good stories because your coverage changes with Washington. The big thing to look at, and especially given a stimulus bill, is pork waste and stupid spending. It's going to be there. It's the nature of government. It's the nature of everything. All it is to find it and have fun looking for it and finding it. Also, almost every administration leaves landmines for their successor. I was covering the end of the Clinton administration. They put in a new arsenic rule that they figured the Bush arsenic in water rule, pretty much daring the Bush administration to repeal it, which they did, which turned out to be a major public relations fiasco, and Clinton people were just laughing quite a bit there. Turf wars that cause inaction. You have Carol Browner, you have Lisa Jackson, you have Stephen Chu, and Senator Salazar. Who's in charge? Supposedly, I guess it's Carol Browner, but and then you have John Holdren, who at this very moment is going through confirmation hearings in the Senate. You're going to have these issues of turf war because these are all strong personalities, and that will be maybe inside the Beltway stories, but when it causes inaction, then there'll be war. Pork waste and stupid spending. There will be failures because there's always failures no matter who's in charge, and those will be fun to write, and those will be things to watch. And then, of course, there'll be waste and stupid spending. So my contact information, which is not there, so I don't know what happened to all that, but if you need me, I'm at sborenstein, SBORENSTEIN, @ap.org.
Explain the photograph, though.
The photograph, there are perks to being a science writer. This is a private vomit comet, 0G. They were sending teachers up in it to experience zero gravity, 30-some parabolas of 16 parabolas of zero gravity. You go up in a converted commercial jet straight up, and then straight down. So on the way up, you get 3 Gs, and on the way down, you get 0. Or sometimes they change the parabola so you get about the lunar gravity. I wanted to experience this correctly. Because this is sort of a commercial thing, they've got it all down to just how many before people get sick. They encourage people to use certain medications not to get sick. And NASA's old version used to be called the Vomit Comet for a very good reason. But, if you're going to write about this, you don't want to take medicine that will dull your senses. My photographer, he took medicine. Around parabola 15, I was starting to really look bad. The people for 0G kept hovering around me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I can make it. I'm just, barely making it." And parabola 16, which was the last scheduled one, I go, "Okay, I survived." And then the pilot comes on and says, "Because you guys are having so much fun, we're going to give you a couple more." There's just nothing you can do. The good thing is I did not lose it. I came very close. But this is some of the fun things you get to do. And hopefully there will be some people out there left to do this, and I'll be left to do this, and there'll be fun things like this.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Sorry, no slideshow. Maybe that's because I come from the radio background where the voice is everything. So, yeah, you close your eyes. Imagine you're listening to your radio. When I started covering the environment beat at the beginning of the Bush administration, I would never have guessed that I'd be still doing this 8 years later. Environment is just the latest of a lot of beats I've covered, and there are challenges for me in covering this. The first time I tried to understand how mercury from air pollution gets into fish, I thought, why doesn't the Los Angeles Times want someone with a science background covering the environment? I was acutely aware that there were some holes in my background. My background is in Russian studies, and when I was based in Moscow, Russian studies came in handy, not so much at a global warming hearing. And when I was in Russia, I did do some environmental stories. I did a story about the impact of the Chernobyl disaster, and went to a town in the Arctic called Nikel where there was incredible pollution. And doing those stories made me acutely aware that there was so much I didn't understand about the science and the environmental background of those stories. And at that time, I didn't know how to learn what I needed to know to tell the stories fully. Hopefully, now, after 8 years of covering this beat, I've learned how to learn the things I need to do so that I can understand the stories and communicate them to the people who listen to my stories at NPR. I covered the beat first for 4 years for the LA Times and then for 4 years for NPR, which has given me kind of an interesting view of doing the same kind of beat from a different medium. At the LA Times, they gave me lots of time to work on the stories. I was able to spend months sniffing around the agencies and tromping through places like the coal fields of West Virginia and eastern Wyoming's coal bed methane boom to try to understand how the Bush administration policies were having an impact on the environment and on our country. And doing the same beat at NPR is not the same at all. For broadcast journalism, the NPR stories are long, but they're not full of all the kinds of nerdy details and facts that I love to put in the LA Times stories. Instead, I'm looking for scenes and sound effects and characters and storytelling devices. I did a whole piece on a physical examination of a dolphin. There I was, kind of kneeling in the boat next to the dolphin with my big microphone, getting of the dolphin's breath into the story, and that was basically what the whole story was about. Of course, it was the challenges that polluted waterways present to this species, but it was also just a story about a physical examination. So the way that I tell stories is very different, but whether it was for the Los Angeles Times or now for NPR, it involves a lot of time and a lot of resources, taking trips to places like Midway Island, where I did a story about the challenge that all the plastic pollution is presenting to that we throw out here is presenting to places very far away in the middle of the ocean, and also a kind of quirky little piece about a young scientist, field scientist, who spends all of his time crawling around on his belly on deserted islands, falling after an endangered duck. So all different kinds of stories with lots of things to do, but as you can tell, they take a lot of resources. At NPR, as in the newspaper, it's important to dig in and try to figure out what is the government doing that maybe it doesn't want us to know that it's doing. And the Bush administration was great for giving us those things to dig into. A year and a half ago or so, I had a scoop, emails from the White House telling EPA not to go for a really strong standard on how much ozone was allowed in the air. and during my newspaper eras, I would have taken that scoop and written it straight out as quickly as I could. Because I was at NPR, instead I wanted to tell a story to try to explain it to my listeners, and so I went with a woman who has a lung ailment to the track early the next morning, and she has to exercise on Code Orange days. She has to exercise before the sun is up because it's painful for her if she doesn't do it then. And then she spends the rest of the day behind closed doors. And so I used her as my way of telling the story. And in fact, that scoop that I had was just a few lines in the middle of the story. But the story hopefully was able to show people or tell people who are listening that there is an impact to these decisions that the government's making. By not making the standards stronger, there are more days that she has to spend behind closed doors. And so as you can tell, these are all things that I feel very grateful for getting the chance to cover. I love the environment beat. It's so varied. Now global warming is a story that never stops giving. There are more stories than any of us can ever count. And fortunately, first the LA Times and now NPR gives me the time and the resources to go and do these stories, and I'm very grateful for that. But it's a changing time, as Seth pointed out for you with all of his slides. The LA Times Washington Bureau, where I did those stories, is now closed. There's no one doing those stories that I got a chance to do when I was there. And at NPR, we just had a big layoff. The NPR still has a big commitment to environment stories, and there still are people doing them like me, but it's a different place than it was, and we miss our colleagues who are gone. And it's just a little sign of what is happening across the industry. I still see a lot of reporters at global warming hearings. They're up on the Hill. If you go there, you'll see all those press spots are filled, but they are representing different organizations. There are a lot fewer reporters from newspapers there, and there are more people from online services. And many of these online services provide really interesting coverage, but it's a different kind of thing. A lot of times it's a subscription service that you have to pay a lot of money to have access for. And so I'm thrilled that those people are still there covering the news, but it's not quite the same, I think, as the old style journalism, and I'm concerned about what that means for what the public gets to learn. I think that if you're an expert or if you're an advocate, you can find out what you want to learn much more than you were ever able to find out 5 or 10 years ago. And so there is more information available online, and especially if you'll pay for it, but even if you won't pay for it, there's more information online. But what about the person who's not particularly interested? Will they just run across it in the newspaper that they pick up and read? I think it's worth thinking about, because these, as we understand about our country, it's a democracy, and if people care about the issue, that's what the politicians care about. And there is a lot of concern about climate change and other environmental issues in the country, but if people are not getting informed about the latest things, I think it will have an impact on how much the politicians care about it. We've had pledges from the Democratic leaders on the Hill and from the Obama administration that they're going to go ahead with major legislation to curtail greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's a huge effort that they want to undertake, and there are huge political stumbling blocks in the way. Will they manage to do that? It seems, well, they're all from the same party. Shouldn't they be able to do it? Well, actually, it will be very hard to do. And what would push them to do it would be a public that understood the challenge and was concerned enough to push their politicians to do it. And does that exist? Doesn't that exist? I believe that whether or not that exists right now, or whether that or not that will exist in the future, has a lot to do with what the public is learning through the media. And hopefully there will still be reporters around who will cover this in depth. I do think there's a big role to play. And there are a lot of changes going along, as Seth was able to detail in a lot of, give you a lot of details about. So it'll be interesting to see, and I mean, it's not a complete depression in the industry, but it's just startling to see how things are changing. So what stories will I be looking at as the future goes? What stories will the other reporters who are covering the environment look at in the future? I think that all the money in the stimulus package will provide endless stories to follow, because a lot of that money will go to supposedly push us towards a greener future. And it'll be interesting to see how it works. Will the electric grid actually get any smarter? We're going to spend tens of billions of dollars to get it there. Let's go and look and see how much smarter is the electric grid getting. Will any of those changes actually make their way into real people's houses and change the way people use electricity? Make them use it smarter or make them use less of it. That'll be interesting to see. Those will provide great stories. And of course, this huge story of whether or not the country will decide to curtail greenhouse gas emissions and what way they're going to do it, that's going to provide, I think you can count on dozens and hundreds of stories on those topics, so that will be there. And there are lots and lots of questions in that coverage that are fascinating to me. And one of the things that I think I didn't cover enough of in previous efforts of Congress to do something about climate change was, what are they going to do if they set up a cap and trade system, which they're talking about doing? That will potentially bring in enormous revenues. And what's going to happen with that money? Will that money be doled out kind of 16,000, 17,000 ways, just kind of like a stimulus package every year? Well, I think that's one of the reasons that bill sunk last time, is that it kind of looked like pork. Will it be passed out? Will it be handed back to the American people? That's what some of the people I've spoke to are talking about, and that's an interesting idea. So what happens with the money in a big public, as a result of a big program like that, will be a big story to follow. And of course, what are the ongoing impacts to our environment from climate change? I think that those will be stories that hopefully NPR will still have enough money to put me on planes to go and look into and sniff around about, and hopefully Seth will still be on those planes figuring those things out. We'll see. So there you go.
Okay, next we'll have Jan Schaffer, and my colleagues in the booth, this would be the time that we'd like to run the short video.
Actually, not just that. I want to set it up.
Okay, you set it up first.
But that's a good cue that I want to play.
Heads up.
I run JLab. Nobody really gets what JLab does, but I'm actually a center that tries to hire and create funded projects for a lot of journalists who don't have jobs anymore, as well as ordinary citizens. So we've funded about 60 startups around the country in the last 4 years. And what I think we also do is reward innovations in journalism. We publish e-learning portals to sort of impart some big J journalism values to newly emergent journalists around the country. The most prominent is the Night Citizen News Network. It's kcnn.org. So I want to show you today, you're going to be the first to see, because it's still in post-production, a slice, a 4-minute slice of some of the initiatives that we see cropping up around the country that actually make me more optimistic than pessimistic about the state of news, not necessarily the state of news organizations, okay? I want to leave you with 3 thoughts today. One is that we are more than ever before entering a period in which there is demand for an architecture of participation, and it's filling a culture of contribution. Ordinary people want to be able to contribute and participate in some way in the news media ecosystem. And it may be somewhat passive by commenting. It may be much more active by actually creating the news, okay? But we're seeing a fairly robust sphere of activity happening there. The second thing I would suggest is that we are seeing ordinary people committing both random and not so random acts of journalism. All right, the random acts of journalism are very much you're uploading your photos and your videos, and if you're an eyewitness to a breaking news event. Organized acts of journalism are happening around the country with the startup of both hyperlocal news initiatives covering communities that have very little news coverage right now, or niche subject initiatives that may cover a special topic like science or environmental journalism, or maybe investigative journalism, or maybe international journalism. Fairly robust sphere happening. And the third thought that I would like to suggest for you is that news vacuums will be filled. They just might not all be filled by big J journalists. And how that's going to play out in the long run, we don't know yet. But we are seeing a lot of activity in this arena as well. We see big J journalists starting their own news initiatives. We see small J journalists, which I would call ordinary citizens, filling gaps. They haven't had coverage for a long time. And I think we forget when we are on the East Coast how many communities in the hinterlands have little or no available media. This is not something new to them to see declining news coverage. And so they're taking upon themselves to do it themselves. And they are creating their own news initiatives and by and large not doing a bad job of it. They're trying to be like big J journalists, which is very heartening to see. I would point you to regional initiatives that are also happening. NewWest.net. I did want to do a PowerPoint and a video, but look at NewWest.net. One of its covers 10 states in the Rocky Mountains regions. Well, guess what? The Rocky Mountains region does not have a lot of available media. And one of their focuses is science and the environment and growth, which are all huge topics in their neck of the woods. Funded by venture capitalists, going great guns, do big conferences on science and the environment, do publish magazines. It's a sample of a kind of new initiative we're seeing. I think we're also seeing, in the vacuums will be filled category, the emergence of what I would call new civic media networks. And these are content sharing agreements that we've never seen before, which is a fundamental change in the mindset of journalists. We have always been competitive. We always want to scoop. But now we have 8 of the major newspapers in Ohio in a formal collaboration called ONO, the Ohio News Organization. We have 3 newspapers in Florida, the Miami Herald, Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, and Palm Beach Post that are collaborating. Yesterday, the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette say they're going to share content. The Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post are now sharing content. So we have an entirely different mindset right now of people who would never share before saying, okay, how can we leverage the resources that we have to avoid duplicative journalism and create some value-added journalism? So I want to show you today a 4-minute piece of a video that we have produced. It's in post-production right now, that focuses on foundation-funded media, okay, and the role that community foundations can play in supporting information infrastructures in their community, not necessarily as acts of journalism, but as acts of community building and community information sharing. And what we're finding, again, is that there's a lot of activity in this arena. I want to focus on one of my favorite projects around the country. In fact, NPR just did a piece on it recently, the voiceofsandiego.org. Seeded 4 years ago with $300,000 from a local philanthropist in the community, now operating on a budget of just under $1 million with 11 reporters and focus on 6 really topics of coverage, including science and the environment. Could you roll the video now, please?
San Diego is a city of 1.3 million citizens, but just one daily newspaper. The Union Tribune is challenged, as are many big city dailies, by plummeting ad sales and the movement of its tech-savvy readers to online alternatives. Staff layoffs have left many stories uncovered, and circulation hasn't been helped by the outdoor, laid-back lifestyle of its readers or the transient population of the many military bases that ring its silvery harbor. San Diego is close to the troubled Mexican border and is host to a substantial population of immigrants. And it's also a home port for some of the Navy's Pacific Fleet and a booming cruise ship industry. Its city government has a $3.3 billion budget, but public accountability at City Hall seemed lacking to some of the city's most prominent citizens, like philanthropist Buzz Woolley, and that led to serious problems.
The most obvious one was their lack of coverage of the pension problem in San Diego.
Woolley's solution? Help create an investigative website, Voice of San Diego, that pursued the pension scandal until the mayor resigned.
It has put San Diego in the position of being close to bankrupt. So an alternative source of information was necessary, and the internet gives us the ideal avenue to do that.
VoiceofSanDiego.org is a website sharply focused on just a few topics. Editors Scott Lewis and Andrew Donahue were recruited from a local business journal.
The core areas that we cover are politics, education, what we call survival in San Diego. That's housing, jobs, local economy, the public health, which really focuses on the environment, public safety, and then science and technology, because that is actually a huge part of our local economy here.
Every day somebody says you should cover this concert, or you should cover this sporting event, and you'd get more readership if you did. And it's hard at first. You realize they do have some truth to them. If you were able to cover all those different things better, you would get more readership. The problem is that we have to focus on what we have and what we can do best.
Sam Hodgson, age 24, is chief photo editor. Kelly Bennett, also 24, is a reporter. Both had experience and training as journalists before joining The Voice, as did the rest of the 9-member staff.
When we first told people what we were, I don't think they quite got it. I think they figured we were going to be, a bunch of kids sitting in our parents' basement wearing sweatpants and drinking Diet Cokes and just firing off, a bunch of opinion blogs or something like that.
Every major story goes through Andy edits almost, every single major news story that comes through, and he sends it back 2 or 3 times, and then after that it gets one final read.
Their journalism sometimes engages readers in unusual ways.
We have a feature we call the People's Reporter, where from time to time one of our beat reporters will basically take a day off of all their stories and everything, and they will solicit either tips, story ideas, or questions from the readers, and they will say, hey, readers, you're my editor today. You go tell me what to do.
How does a startup website compete for readers?
1 minute, guys, 1 minute.
Emily Alpert's top-notch school reporting has brought The Voice wide respect, but on this day, she was on TV raising public awareness of her journalism to viewers of The Voice's television partner.
And so we thought we'd have them take positions on issues that were important to us, the kind of stuff that we argued about in the newsroom.
So far, the audience of Voice of San Diego is modest but growing, and some of the big names in town are starting to read the site.
We've learned that the best way to drive readership through our model is to write better stories and to get more of them. And when we broke a major investigative piece this summer, and we revealed that a woman in charge of an organization, a redevelopment organization fully funded by the city, we found out that she had been giving out bonuses to her top staff that were not disclosed and not approved. The day that came out, the story came out, one of the readers, the mayor, issued a memo within hours saying, I demand that you answer certain questions that were raised in this article. They couldn't. She was fired. The whole board was overhauled. Now the FBI took their computers.
A budget approaching $1 million a year is raised through a combination of advertising, memberships, and grants. But first, the website had to prove its worth.
Once we proved that, then we could turn to them and say, okay, now support us. And that's been the exact way it's happened, and the donations have come in at a record pace over the last year.
As an entrepreneur and venture capitalist, funder Buzz Woolley says startups need more than just money. They need to know their fields and have business management skills. He's opened the door to prospective funders and provided back office support. He thinks The Voice of San Diego has a realistic business model.
The charitable giving in this community, $1 million is relatively small. The San Diego Foundation has supported this. A number of other charities have supported this.
San Diego Foundation Program Officer Cheryl Phelps likes what she sees so far.
The Voice of San Diego is going to take care of the journalism part. They're tested. They're already getting acclaim, a national acclaim for the quality of their work. What we're trying to do is free them up and also open up opportunities for our communities to be more effective in how they get the information and how they also share their own information.
We did not start this as an act of journalism or an act of business. We did this as a civic effort to provide information to the community about things that are important to them.
It's really efforts like this that make me more optimistic than pessimistic about what's going on in the new media ecosystem. We are seeing a lot of vibrant activity. Some of it has incredibly good journalistic DNA. They're not all opinion blogs. In fact, for many of these people, the word blog is kind of something they hold their nose at. They're really looking at creating what feels to them like a newspaper online. And I think we're seeing quite good efforts in that arena. The title of this video is New Media Makers. It is going to be available in about a month. If you want it, give me your card. It will focus on 8 areas, 6 projects around the country, as well as pulling out buckets of who the people are constructing these projects, what are the ethical dilemmas they're confronting, how they fit in the new media ecosystem, and what kind of civic impact they are having in their communities. We also look at the role of foundation funding. So let me cut it there and open it for Peter.
Thank you. I wanted to thank a couple of groups for having me here at the Wilson Center, and one, of course, is the center itself and Jeff's team, terrific people doing important work. And the other one is CNN for agreeing to spare up the time for me to be here for a couple of months. What we've seen and heard from Seth and Elizabeth and Jan is, I think the sum total of what's going on with the beat and where it and all journalism may be headed. And when Jan and I first spoke a couple weeks ago and I began to look at projects like the Voice of San Diego, I'm really impressed and more hopeful than I've been in quite some time. But that, of course, does not mean that it is in its entirety a happy situation. I wanted to talk a little bit about my end of it on television, where we are, how I found myself where I am with a situation after 17 years. I'm now working at CNN, and that's something that I didn't take personally, and I'm not terribly upset about, but at the same time, the beat and any full-time attention to science and environment were eliminated, and I thought that was a little astounding. It tends to get marginalized as a beat for a number of reasons, and I want to go over those very quickly. Number one is factionalism. Environment coverage and even science coverage are often viewed as polarizing issues, either in the sense that it drives audience away because they don't care, or because issues like creation versus evolution, which, as you know, is still hotly contested issues in communities and churches across this country, even today on Darwin's 200th birthday, will drive a fraction of the audience away if evolution is covered as a legitimate science and not as a political and theocratic theological controversy. Environmental issues, global warming, about 20% of the American public, it varies in polls, still believes that global warming either just doesn't exist or is a hoax, or is some kind of fiendish plot
by scientists and NGOs who are clearly in it for the money to topple coal and oil companies who clearly aren't in it for the money. And in the specific case of CNN, whom I still regard as far and away the best of the three competing national cable news networks in this country, if your primary competition is Fox News, it's a simple business decision. In order to compete and overtake Fox News, you don't need science and environment coverage on a regular basis. One of the things that's changed dramatically in the past few years in terms of the influence of the web is how stories are decided in large news organizations. And in TV, whether it's television news or Dancing with the Stars or O'Reilly or Larry King or anything else, the business model, the very reason for financial being for news businesses is all predicated on the Nielsen ratings. The Nielsen ratings are cumbersome, slow, imprecise, widely mistrusted, very expensive for news organizations to acquire. In other words, news organizations don't like the Nielsen ratings, but they live and die by them. Ad rates, and therefore the revenue, and therefore the existence of every broadcast commercial news organization is still set up based on the Nielsens. And in the old days, you used to take the most precise form of the Nielsen ratings, which are quarterlies, 15-minute chunks to tell you whether or not you lost or gained audience in a 15-minute period, and try and determine whether the audience likes what you're doing. If you have a 2 or 3 minute story, that 15-minute chunk does not give you a very good idea of whether or not that audience received the story well or whether they received it poorly. In the last few years, there is what's regarded as a much better way to measure audience interest, and that's web clicks on your website. There's something you own. There's something that are inherently reliable in terms of measuring audience interest. And there's something that are built into your infrastructure that you don't have to pay for, and therefore there's something you trust. So more and more, what you see on television is driven by how many clicks on a website are given to a specific story. I will ask you the rhetorical question of whether or not that tends to favor stories about quantum physics or whether it tends to favor stories about Paris Hilton. I want to ask a couple of questions to test the depths of your knowledge about news on television. In terms of audience interest as measured by web clicks, what do you think was the most popular story in the last few years concerning NASA? Anybody want to take a stab at that? The astronaut who put on adult diapers and drove from Houston to Orlando in an attempt to kill her romantic rival. You are absolutely right, and the Mars polar lander was a distant second. Although I'm sure they would have flocked if they had that picture of Seth bouncing in the vomit comet. There is a science / wildlife / biology story that also ranked as the top scorer in the last couple of years. It actually, I'll give you a little bit of a hint, it happened about 6 or 8 months ago. Anyone care to take a spin at what that may be?
The polar bear? Alligator eating a child?
That's a reasonable guess, but not correct. Steve Irwin, I actually wasn't factoring Steve Irwin in. That was actually a wildlife-based murder. But yeah, if you were to broaden the category, you might well be right. But the one that I'm thinking about is the 2 security guards in Georgia who put a gorilla suit in the freezer and claimed to have discovered Bigfoot. That was later found out to be a hoax. Now that's journalism. One other question, just to fit the framework of as we see newspapers imperiled this very day, and as we see broadcast journalism as we now know it, pondering its future and the possibility that it, as we know it, may be imperiled in 5 or 10 years. Anyone care to guess what the average age of a viewer is for Fox or CNN? Okay, I heard a range from 43 to 80 here. You're all right to an extent. The correct answer is 60 for CNN and 59 for Fox. And if you tune in to the afternoon broadcast of either network or of MSNBC, which I believe is a little bit lower than that, maybe 58, you will see a profusion of commercials for denture cream, adult diapers, perhaps even the ones the astronaut was wearing, and life insurance, and the little I've fallen and I can't get up thing that's always on TV. Another troubling aspect that crosses all media and looks to our future is that I've had 4 or 5 separate conversations with journalism professors at different universities across this country who said to me some variation of, we don't know what we're supposed to teach anymore. Clearly, it's not to push prospective students to careers in traditional newspapers. But I think there's a real reformation that is going on and that is needed in journalism programs and campuses. That is why it's wonderful to see, amidst the hand-wringing, to see a research and development facility, if I may call it that, Jan, that's looking toward our future, and looking toward our future with some optimism. Because as bad as the picture is, and if you point at environment journalism in particular as a marginal beat in the eyes of many of our bosses and editors, you'll see peaks and valleys of interest and disinterest in coverage. The first one that I can recall in my lifetime is around 1970. In '69, there was a massive oil spill off of Santa Barbara, California, that not only was an ecological disaster in its own right, but it was a telegenic ecological disaster because it was right on the beach, near a major media market, and in a way that made available pictures that told the story in a very tragic way. That same year, the Cuyahoga River caught fire and burned. It was actually the 10th time in history that the Cuyahoga River had caught fire and burned, but it was the first time that it appeared widely in television and that it sparked a national debate about water quality. Within a year, we had our first Earth Day in this country. The EPA was founded. And the guy who, by his track record, is truly the most distinguished environmental president, signed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and a slew of other laws within a few years. And that environmental president was, of course, Richard M. Nixon. That interest waned over the next few years as society got the feeling that problems were taken care of and that the beat was not quite as important as a journalism beat that it might have been in those years perceived as a crisis. We got to 1982. There was a regime change in 81 and 82 that brought in eventually embarrassment and scandal-plagued officials like Ann Gorsuch and James Watt to the EPA and the Interior Department. As great changes were underfoot and there was a resurgence of activism and concern, the beat was elevated once more. That too went away. By the end of that decade, in 1990, we had seen Bhopal and Chernobyl and the first reports from Hansen and others of dire reports about climate change, the first dire reports about the ozone hole, very telegenic, again, story about medical waste on the beaches of New Jersey and New York. And by 1990, Earth Day was again ascendant. NGOs saw a tremendous rise in their public support. And Earth Day was a 2-hour primetime TV special on ABC hosted by Bette Midler. That too waned. In the meantime, we saw an event that distracted all of America and perhaps all of the world from attention to many issues, and that was September 11th and the war on terror. I had been at CNN for about 10 years at that point. I found myself relocated to running the military desk and supervising an element of war coverage for both the Afghan invasion and the war in Iraq, or at least the mission accomplished portion of the war in Iraq. And but around 2005, 2006, spurred on by questions about Katrina's potential link to global warming and a renewed interest, as evidenced by Al Gore winning an Emmy, an Oscar, a Grammy, and a Nobel Peace Prize all in the same year while talking about climate change. There was again a brief resurgence that was experienced in news organizations. That has died out in a hurry due to the economic meltdown. You may recall little less than a year ago, as we were pondering the impact of $4 a gallon gasoline, there was an increased attention to alternative energy. That seems to have died out. So what we're dealing with on this beat is sort of this manic depressive mode of public attention where we have those parabolas, just like on Seth's plane, where attention rises and wanes. That's a challenge for coverage. It's certainly a challenge, I'm sure, from the standpoint of policymakers. But the issues certainly are not going away. They may be presented in a different context as we see with the change in presidential administration, but they're not going away. Right now, as was mentioned before, I do have to correct Seth. He described me in his slide as a former management flunky at CNN. The industry term, correctly, Seth, is I was a management weasel. That's just a broadcast term, but that's what we did call it. Right now I'm writing for a website, mnn.com, 3 columns a week. Tomorrow I'll write, actually based on a session here at the Wilson Center a week ago, on water. Peter Glick, who is, for years has been a brilliant and foresightful analyst of some of the crises facing the world from both clean water and in some cases the absence of water. And yesterday I wrote on a Green Jobs Conference that was held here in Washington where I had an encounter with Jimmy Hoffa, not the dead one, the son of the dead one, as the Teamsters Union has now joined an alliance, a growing alliance between trade unions and environmentalists in pursuit of a piece of the recovery pie and a piece of the green jobs opportunities that are out there. Those things represent emerging beats that need to be covered. I'm having a great time writing for this website. I also have a concern about the new dichotomy of the media, and that is that a website on any specialized topic, whether it's a sports website or a science website or an environment website, tends to draw those who choose to be engaged rather than drawing an audience of the general public, which is what institutions like the Associated Press or NPR or CNN have always done. And in a sense, to the extent that our mission as journalists is to inform and to educate, it may leave us primarily educating those who are already relatively educated and leaving those who may not be so educated in the dark. I hope we can find a way around that. I think Jan's, the projects that Jan is assisting and advising and shepherding are a great start, but we've got a long, long way to go. Thanks.
Well, many thanks to all 4 of you. I think it really gave us a lot to work with and chew on. I should have mentioned before that we are broadcasting this live on the web, of course, trying to use this multiple platforms. And what that means for us in the room really is just when we come to a question, if you could wait for one of my colleagues to bring the microphone so folks online can hear it live, and then when we put the archive video up. So although I'm tempted to jump in with questions, I will hold some and give you all in the audience an opportunity. Why don't we start with John Fialka from Climate Wire down here.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is John Fialka. I'm the editor of a new internet publication called Climate Wire. And I'd like to shed some glee on this fast in that we have gone from 0 to 10 reporters in a year. We just hired a European bureau chief. We have about 40,000 readers. We are regarded, as we found out yesterday from Howie Kurtz's column, as a niche publication, which big J journalists like to dismiss. There's a couple of big differences. We are growing like Topsy. People are buying our news, Qua News. Not all of them are lobbyists. Our clientele includes government agencies, universities, Sierra Club, Pew Center, lots of media outlets. There is a hunger for news here. There are people who have a lot invested in the issue of climate change. If climate change is a niche issue, as I was telling somebody a moment ago, we are plumbing the Grand Canyon of niches because there is no bigger, no more sprawling issue in either the beats of energy and environment today. Now, there is a certain sadness and a little tone of smugness about how the great science reporters did this in the past. If you look 10 years ago at Kyoto and see Al Gore go back to a country where the public interest in this issue is pretty close to zero, as reflected by the Senate, it's a very thin issue. It's an issue that Joe Sixpack still doesn't get. And if he says he's concerned about it, if you ask him in a proper poll whether he's concerned about the economy, schools, crime, Britney Spears, or climate, climate always falls off as last. So I would say, although we are not in good shape as journalists generally, we haven't done a great job in the past. We've indulged ourselves in a lot of small particle science. The latest small particle can pass right through the Earth at the speed of light. What is it? The article never answers. Breakthrough science, tremendous breakthroughs every day. You see this a lot in medical journalism. Where do they go? We don't know. What environmental groups want. A lot of us deliver that message without really getting into, is that good public policy? Is that something that Congress is interested in and will buy? I think there are a lot of things we have to do before our news becomes saleable in the broad market. And I think we should reflect a little bit on whether we've been delivering a product that people want to have. Clearly, what you're describing here is a real danger to an informed democracy. But what it needs is thought, is not wringing our hands in how we got here, and how do we climb out of this hole. And all I can say is there are elite audiences that are very interested. They're not being served by big J journalism, and so little j is going to grow like Topsy. And if you dismiss this as niches, or you sneeze at somebody who sells news for the news value, you're about to be surprised. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any reflections?
You know, I think you're absolutely on the money, and I think that what a little project like Voice of San Diego is now discovering is they are getting funding from local environmental groups who are contributing to Voice of San Diego because they understand that Voice can give them a little more of a megaphone on their issues, and the whole community has to know about these issues. So you get sort of a whole new relationship now between niches and niches, if you will.
If I may, John, as a person who does read Climate Wire and someone who helped steal away one of your reporters, I think there's great value in Climate Wire. I think you really are serving would have been an untapped market. But you also point out that you talked about Joe Sixpack saying that this would fall off Joe Sixpack's radar. On the big J journalism that Elizabeth and I guess represent here, we're the Joe Sixpack's not going to subscribe to Climate Wire. One that can't afford it, doesn't know about it, and may not be interested on it until they read about it or hear about it or see it in big J journalism. I mean, that's where our job is, to provide them enough news that then they're interested in to plumb in even further depth in places like yours or MNN or Grist or wherever. And we are doing that.
But that's just until ClimateWire negotiates its agreement with Google and with Politico. I mean,
You
it's
still
just a matter of time.
you still have to be interested enough to go to it.
Actually, it's the New York Times that's about to have the agreement with us.
There you go.
But you still have to be interested enough, for the 20% who think, climate change is, the grand hoax. They're not going to be going to you, and nor will the other 60% who put it down way down the list. Like it or not, we're sort of the first door, and eventually, once we get their interest, then you're the next door. And I think both doors are important, but don't go around telling us that you can live without us, because they're not going to come to you if they haven't heard it from one of us.
The bottom line is you need both, and one is thriving. And John's done a wonderful job on this for 20 years for both the big J and little j journals at the Wall Street Journal. But you need both. And what Jan just suggested and what John just reported, and that's great news, that the expertise in a place like ClimateWire can be available and be distributed to that much larger audience is really what we're after. And what has to be there in order for that threat to democracy that you so rightly described to be less of a threat, and to make the broader public, the people who vote, the people who you mentioned Joe Sixpack. I guess we've stopped using Joe the Plumber, but to make sure that there is a clear understanding and an ability to decide in a democracy which issues are important and which issues aren't, so that someday at least we get past Britney Spears, and then maybe we can overtake Paris Hilton.
Okay, gentleman right here.
I think the point isn't so much a question of what's more important, the niche organizations or the general news organizations, but how do you, how do we as journalists write science and environment stories that people care about and that tell people why they should care about these issues? And I'd like you guys to talk about that. And also, there's a perception in a lot of areas that that science and environment reporters are biased towards towards the left, or towards that they're in cahoots with the environmentalists, and that some of this comes up in the way stories like global warming are told, and about whether some of these issues are decided, or whether the debate is over. And I'd like you to talk about that too.
And sir, I was remiss in not reminding everyone to identify yourself, if you could let us know.
Warren Durrell, USA Today.
Thank you very much.
I don't mind starting on that. I think that right now we're seeing two things happening, and that is that people want to engage with your journalism. So science and environmental writers need to figure out ways, entry points for that engagement. We've funded 3 projects. GreatLakesWiki.org with the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism focuses on the 56 toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes. But it's a wiki that everyone can contribute to. We funded VermontClimateWitness.org, and it's an attempt to have ordinary citizens look at the maple sugar run and look at how climate is really affecting parts of New England. Green Jobs Philly. All of these are entry points that you need to build into your reporting nowadays. And I think if you do that, you get more legs for your story. I think the second point I would make is that increasingly big J journalists have to become their own marketers of their journalism. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but I mean that you need to be virally spreading the word about your story. And I think the master of who's done this recently is John Sawyer at the Pulitzer Center, who not only publishes the story for online and then gets it on Frontline, and then somebody else picks it up, and now they're carting it around the country, showing they've tapped into the Speakers Bureau's budgets of colleges around the country, and they're going to colleges and presenting it to hundreds of students at a time. So I mean, there are ways now that you get your story out. You don't just rely on the same old delivery platform that you've always used.
Okay.
Wait, okay.
So, no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
In terms of, to address your issue about, first to go on entry points to a story, I think it's really not too much different between science and environment journalism and everyday journalism. Elizabeth talked about storylines, telling a story, narratives. You just look for where you can bring the story of climate change, such, if you want to use that as an example, into everyday life. The real story and the real future reporting on climate change right now is on impacts, which is a horrible word, but it's not as bad as mitigation. And what will this mean? So, for example, I spent a couple months on stories on sea level rise changes and where it's expected, how much. Same with changes in phenology, which is the timing of spring and fall and bird species and all sorts of animals and wildfires. And you do these, and you intensely, you bring in graphic components, you localize it, and you go in Boston, you can compare to Henry David Thoreau and see the timing changes. So you bring in these stories, you tell it through a researcher who uses Thoreau's own journals and comparing when things happen. In terms of the left or right thing, I use, as a science writer, I rely not exclusively but nearly exclusively on peer-reviewed journals. So if you look at the peer-reviewed journals in climate change, we're talking extremely the science community realistically is pretty close to one area there, if you look at peer-reviewed journals. Much of the other stuff you hear about is not in peer review, and peer review is the gold standard in science journals. So that's where I base. When I see a paper in a peer review journal that doesn't follow what would be the global warming consensus you've heard about, that's even more newsworthy to me. Yeah. For example, one of the big issues in climate change coverage is the hurricanes in the Atlantic. Are they increasing? Are they not increasing? Are they getting stronger? And there's genuine debate because you have two different communities with two different expertise disagreeing. So when Chris Landsey at NOAA, who is a disciple of Bill Gray, one of the bigger climate change deniers and a longtime source of mine, came out with a paper saying, no, you cannot show an increase in stronger hurricanes in the Atlantic. I wrote about that. When Kerry Emanuel came out with a paper saying, yes, you can. I wrote about that too. I mean, that's one of those areas where the consensus is starting to gel, but hasn't there. So you follow where the science is.
I should just add one other thing because I think much to your last point, I should say something about that. I had sort of a weird path into my CNN career. I came out of the activist community back in the 20th century, and it's an issue and a beat, speaking just about the environment, less about science, save possibly for the political entanglements that always seem to surround climate change stories. That is very different in its nature. And Bruce Babbitt, who was Clinton's Interior Secretary, had a great way of describing it, that environmental politics and by extension environmental reporting was just this train wreck of science, ideology, money, in some cases even religion, and certainly politics. It's hard to disentangle those. Also bear in mind that coverage of whether it's climate change or whether it's other environmental topics tends to play out very, very differently and be perceived very differently in the United States than it is elsewhere in the world. climate change is not a partisan issue in other parts of the world nearly to the extent that it is here. And it's through that prism that our work is often defined, and when it's criticized, that's the prism through which it's often criticized. What I've done over the years, most of which is available online, all I can say is, having come out of clearly one side of the debate as part of my background years ago, is take a look at what I've done and judge for yourself. But beyond that, environmental reporting is always in peril. Tim Wheeler, who's here, the past president of SEJ, not to call you out on this one, Tim, but you know that within SEJ, as a former board member, that is always a topic of discussion when reporting on this issue crosses the line into advocacy. And it always will be. And it is much more of an issue, perhaps in Washington than in the rest of the country, but certainly more in the United States than the rest of the world. And it's part of that larger framework that it's been out there for many, many years, that the media itself, in all beats and in all aspects, the general media has a liberal bias. And all we can do is look at that, do our best work, make it stand up to the light of day, and take the heat, which often comes from both sides.
Okay, gentlemen back here, and then we'll make way across. And perhaps what we'll have to do is take a couple at a time and let you divide and conquer in them, because we want to make sure everyone gets a chance. Yes, please, sir.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. This has been really good. My name is Elliott Negin. I'm the media director for the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm a former journalist. I was the managing editor of American Journalism Review for about 5 years back in the 90s, so I used to write about journalism. One quick point and then a question. The quick point is that I think we're all burdened by the fact that it's a stunning statistic. Only 15% of Americans over 25 have a four-year college degree. And it doesn't mean they took much in science in college either. So Americans in general have a very low IQ when it comes to science and environment. So that's one thing that we're all burdened by as either advocates or journalists. And I think Peter mentioned that roughly 20% of the population still believes that global warming is a hoax. And one thing, I as a practitioner and then an observer of journalism, and especially when it comes to environment, I noted that when it comes to the political environmental stories, often because journalists are trained to give both sides of a story, we continually and still see organizations that are funded largely by corporations who don't want to see any regulation, like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, for example. They're constantly being quoted as on the other side on the climate issue. And CEI, for example, has no scientists on its staff. And they're generally not properly identified in news stories as to where they get their funding or who they represent or what these organizations are all about. And the general public has no idea who these people are. They call their people, their staff members, scholars. And they're constantly debunking the idea. First, they debunked the idea that climate change actually was happening, and now they're saying, well, it's not going to be as bad as everyone thinks, and we shouldn't bother spending. We should be spending money on poverty and war and other issues. This is not a big deal. And I constantly see these people popping up in stories, and then also the handful of contrarians who are out there versus the rest of the scientific community who's basically there's a consensus that there's a problem here. So that's a general problem with all reporting, is that we constantly see this balance, he said, she said type of reporting that goes on that I think confuses the public and has confused the public for years and has held back progress on doing anything about this issue. One last thing, one other thing, the political part of the story is that the fossil fuel polluters, the coal industry, the oil industry, have been giving 80% of their money over the last 20 years to the Republican Party for campaign contributions. As Peter pointed out, Richard Nixon was the premier environmental president of the of the last 40 years or so. But back then, environmental issues were bipartisan. Republicans supported environmental issues too, but the Republican Party has largely been captive of polluter dollars. And that is occasionally talked about, but people don't really talk about the connection. Anyway, so I guess my major question, or what I'd like you to address, is the whole issue of he said, she said, balanced journalism, reporting both sides, and then therefore confusing the public on a very critical public issue.
Terrific, thank you. We're going to take a couple. Hedrick Smith, please, Megan, right there. And then the lady right behind him, and we'll give you a chance for those three.
Thanks. Hedrick Smith. I'm producing right now for PBS Frontline a documentary on the environment, my first venture into the environment, called Poisoned Waters. It's coming on April 21st. And in that connection, I was struck by comments that Pete Dykstra and Liz Schogren made about the nature of public debate. And my question really is, can we expect a sensible and informed public debate in Congress and among the policymakers if the general public is less and less served by general publications, whether Voice of San Diego or the Wall Street Journal, CNN, the New York Times, whatnot? I have to say that in my reporting, I was new to this field. I'm totally stunned by the enormous gap between the dialogue among the scientists and the experts and the activists about the environment and the general public. If you take a place like Seattle, where you all, we cover Puget Sound, where you all pointed out both the Post-Intelligencer and Seattle Times had excellent coverage. The notion of what the shape of Puget Sound is among the experts, which is disaster, and among the general public, which is really very good, is enormous. They aren't even talking the same language. So while I admire and respect what John Fialco is doing, I don't see how specialized newsletters now delivered on the internet are going to get the public informed. My question is, can we have an intelligent debate purely on the basis of niche or specialized newsletters delivered on the internet, or do we need general journalism, either at the local level, Voice of San Diego, or the national level?
Okay, terrific. And one more just right behind you there, and then we'll give our panel a chance to respond.
Hi, I'm Betty Hudson from National Geographic, and I am oddly playing off Hedrick's question, but we were not in cahoots. My question is for Jan, because I'm intrigued by your top-line description of JLab, and I gather you're getting your funding from the Knight Foundation and Ford, and you guys have moved to AU. But are you partnering with more mainstream media organizations to figure out how to leverage the creativity and the new techniques that you all are incubating, and how is that working, and how do you pick what you're playing with? So it's kind of a complimentary question.
Want me to start?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, we are partnering. In fact, we're about to launch a network journalism initiative that will partner 5 news organizations around the country with 5 niche initiatives in their community to see if we can get some collaboration. To Rick's point, I would say Puget Sound has 2 daily newspapers, not to mention what's in Tacoma and Everett and Olympia. And if the citizens there don't know about what's happening in Puget Sound from the general media that's available, I don't think that it means that they're not going to know it if only niche publications are available. And to Elliott's question, I would say, I really think that yet another initiative we're going to be doing this year is a project called Reimagining Journalism, because I would assert that it's not just the business model of journalism that's broken, but the journalism is broken too, and that the public increasingly is dissatisfied with some journalistic conventions that we employ on automatic pilot without really thinking them through. And I think false equilibriums are one of them. We think of balance as the extremes, but balance actually is in the middle. The scorecard journalism that we produce, the conflict framing that we use, I think are all not necessarily conventions that are being employed in the new media world.
I'd I'd like to comment on a couple of those points. As far as what Elliott Negin had to say about how journalism is all on the one hand, on the other hand, as far as I've done lots and lots of stories on the climate change issue. My colleagues on the science desk have done lots and lots of stories for NPR. I did stories for LA Times before that, and none of my stories or my colleagues' stories were on the one hand. On the other hand, did they include other people's views, especially if it was a political topic? Sure. If you're talking about a Senate debate on an issue and that the debate is furious, and there are people with a lot of power, say maybe the chairman of the Senate Environment Committee who thinks it's a hoax. Did he get some airtime? Sure he does, because he matters. And if you haven't noticed, the Senate hasn't done anything yet, and that's largely because a lot of people still hold the view that they don't want to do something like this. So are those views valid? Yes. Do they belong in the media? Yes. You can't just talk about scientists and what they have to say, and the best scientists will tell you that we can give you the best science, but we can't make the political changes, the policy changes that will change our world. That's what we've left for the politicians to do in our society. And so is Hedrick Smith's comment right, that if a public doesn't understand these things, the politicians are not going to make these changes? Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's stunning how story after story in the mainstream media about just how serious the problem is, and Al Gore's superstar status hasn't really filtered down yet to the average person. And what's the reason? I don't think it's John Fialka's fault. In fact, I think that, sorry, John, but I think that your organization is an incredible source for the general public, because you might have 40,000 readers, but those include me, and my listeners include millions of people all the time. And so I think that your organization makes a big difference in what kind of information is available to the public, but it's still not filtering down enough. And that might make Elliott Negin angry. But I don't think that the answer is the answer that people keep bringing up in forums like this, is that it's the media's fault because they're all on the one hand, on the other hand. I think if you honestly go back and look at the New York Times stories and look at the NPR stories and look at the huge hundreds and hundreds of stories that have come out in recent years, you can't really say that that's true. And so there's another reason. And if you want things to change, I think, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's new media that gets people more engaged. New ways to tell the stories. That's what I'm partly trying to do, is find new ways to tell the stories that involve reaching real people's lives and showing people what they can do, because you care a lot more about something if you can actually do something about it. If it's just something that is being debated on Capitol Hill or that those other people have power over, then it's hard to really care that much about it. So I don't know.
If I can jump in on Elliott's point, the phrase often you hear is balance is bias. And about 10 years ago, give or take a few years, that was a big issue. But what you have to do, as Elizabeth would say, is you've got to split essentially the type of climate change stories in two. You have the stories about the science of climate change. If you look at those, you do not see, certainly as much as a decade ago, the issue of balance is bias. But if you look at the policy and what to do about it, CEI, that is a legitimate point of view. You may not agree with it, but in terms of policy, there are all sorts of points of views on what to do or even whether to do something about it. And if you are writing about policy, then it's fair. If you're writing about what are the projected temperature increases over the century, or sea level rise, or impacts on species, that's a little different. And you don't see that in most places. I mean, and even one of the changes a decade ago, in 1998, when it was at Knight Ridder, one of the first climate change stories I wanted to do, I had an editor tell me, well, the science is still, up in the air about that. And I said, well, actually, not really. And just 2 years later, different editor, mind you, I was out in, or maybe 3, I was out in Alaska doing a story on climate, how you could see climate change earlier in Alaska than in other parts of the United States. I threw in the obligatory sentence from, I think it might have been Pat Michaels, one of the climate change skeptics. My editor said, my editor took it out. That's not on point. That's not needed. That shows the change. But for example, to bring in one last science story that I did, I think Elizabeth did, there was a paper in Nature about 2 weeks ago on Antarctica, which had always been sort of absent from all the other continents that were warming. Antarctica it was hard to tell what was doing. Some said cooling, some said not doing, changing. And this news day said, well, actually, when you look at it longer term, when you look at it, you do some data gap filling, it is warming. Since that had been one of the biggest points for the skeptics, as they kept pointing, look at Antarctica. Then I thought it was legit to go to the Roger Pilkey seniors and say, okay, what do you say now? Or the John Christies. And I did. But I also went to the Michael Manns and the Andrew Weavers and Stephen Schneider types, too. And as far as what Hendrik Smith said, also most Americans don't believe in evolution, since it's the 200th birthday of Darwin. You can only, you do what you can. It goes back to the cliche. You can lead a horse to water. You can't make him drink. I don't know what more we could do. We are out there on I guess, what Jeff called the front lines, and we are reporting this. But people, it's sort of like the advertising thing. It has to be, you have to get a lot of it before it sinks into the consciousness. And I would say we're at a different point in terms of public consciousness about climate change now than 5 years ago. So, give it time.
Tim Wheeler? Gosh, we have a whole bunch, and we're starting to run out of time, so we'll take a number of them. I apologize. Obviously, a reflection of the interest in the topic, please.
Yes, thanks. I'm Tim Wheeler, a reporter, cover the environment for the Baltimore Sun, the only reporter now, where there had been 3, and a board member and past president of SEJ. To your point about the decline of folks covering the environment, I would have to say that SEJ's membership actually is climbing. It's growing. But it's changing. Our mainstream media members are dropping. We're seeing a lot more independents, a lot more freelancers. Folks are transitioning. So there's a hunger for this. This is the big story. Climate change, the environment, we like to say is the story of the century. People want to cover this. We just have to find platforms for them. I think that's, one reason I came down here today was to hear some messages of hope in addition to commiserating with my friends in mainstream media. I'm working harder than ever and seeing fewer of my words in print because the stories are shorter. There are fewer stories on the front, but I've learned to blog. I'm working on different platforms. I guess the question I would have for Jan and maybe for the others too is, what are the business models that are working in terms of, are there alternatives out there that are surviving without having to have an angel like the Voice of San Diego or constant injections of foundation funding to keep going? The reason newspapers are broken is because advertising, which had subsidized, the serious, boring stuff, is no longer there. And I guess that's to some degree what's happening with broadcasting as well.
Well, I don't think there's a business model. I think there are many business trends that are emerging, and I certainly think we're seeing hybrid support developing. There's some ad support, there's some sponsorships, there's some donor networks, there's some philanthropic stuff, there's some outright, grants for special projects or even beat reporters. More recently, the Knight Foundation has funded beat reporters. And then we're also seeing on some of the hyperlocal projects, these are labors of love. These are boomers who used to coach their kids' soccer teams who now have time on their hands and are electing to participate in their community through the media. And so they're not even aspiring to a business model yet. So time will tell.
Yeah, Thank you for that question, Tim, because it reflects almost word for word for one of our online viewers asking the same thing, who is in part frustrated by having been an independent journalist. Now there are lots of unemployed or looking for work, and the kind of competition for platforms and how to find the model to find outlets for doing it is a real challenge, obviously, for a number of folks. The gentleman in the middle, and then over here, sorry. If you could wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Glenn Hurowitz. I'm the media director for Greenpeace. And before doing that, I also did a lot in politics, both as a writer, a journalist, and an author. And reading political coverage, I often get frustrated by the lack of any content, any policy discussion, which candidates' plans would be better, how, in-depth analysis of how they would affect people and affect the country. But on the environmental side, I often feel like there's not that kind of coverage of passion and movements that there is that could add a little bit of spice, perhaps, to really galvanize people. Betsy Colbert in The New Yorker had a great story that I thought did capture that about Van Jones recently. And I wonder if in environmental journalism there could be more coverage of the millions of people in the environmental movement on a grassroots level who are trying to make change. It may not be exactly a science story, but it is a way to enliven science. I mean, we're having 10,000 people come for the PowerShift, young people come for PowerShift conference coming up. More than 1,000 people are going to participate in the biggest civil disobedience ever on climate at the Capitol Power Plant on March 2nd. And these stories are things that can, I think, take some of the science and make it relevant and exciting in a horse race political fashion.
Okay, terrific. And I'm going to ask you guys to hold off just so we can collect some. I think there's a couple hands right in that row. We'll get you. Promise we'll try to capture lots of them here and then give our panelists the final word, please.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Palmer Olson, and I edit environmentalhealthnews.org. We're an online news service funded by foundations. We also publish thedailyclimate.org. And I'm fascinated and saddened to hear about the discussion about all the layoffs and the state of environmental journalism. My question is whether you can comment on the situation internationally and whether the environmental beat in other countries has been similarly marginalized.
Terrific question. If you could hand that to your colleague right there, yeah.
I actually had a very similar question. I'm Glinda Cooper. I'm not a journalist. I'm an epidemiologist, and I'm with the EPA. And the local and regional initiatives that were described, I think, are really helpful. But some of the most compelling stories and situations are not in this country. They're in other countries. And so the blogger and those local San Diego news organizations are probably not going to be able to get those stories. And so just some comments on how to bring these other stories and situations to us would be really helpful.
Great. If you could pass it straight up to the gentleman there. And I'd say part of one of the places and why it's been so useful to get these international stories is the International Reporting Project, trying to subsidize some of the folks in local markets to get overseas to cover those. So I urge you all to look at their work.
Well, this all flows smoothly. I'm Jonathan Slevin with the Washington Times and had an internationally oriented question also.
Excellent. Thank you.
So there's mention of Joe Sixpack and the gap between reporting and the general public's awareness and knowledge. And I wonder if there's any sense of why, I guess it's Henri and Francois, Liter Bottle of Beaujolais, have a greater awareness of environmental issues.
That's a very good question. Now, there were a couple in the back. We want to just grab those, and then we'll give our panelists a final chance to respond as we come up to the hour. So there are two there. Giving my colleagues a workout, running the microphone around.
I'm Aaron Hurtis. I'm with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And I'm actually with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Seth and Elizabeth Seth in particular, you said, what more can we do if we're giving people a science? And a lot of the public opinion research that we've seen shows that people don't get the basic science. They don't know how CO2 traps heat, and they definitely don't know that CO2 hangs around in the atmosphere for several decades and centuries, and maybe even longer, the recent science indicates. And because they don't understand that, it's very hard for them to grasp the urgency of making emissions reductions if we are to do anything. So in addition to what Glenn talked about, which I think is the other really exciting thing about the climate movement and news stories there and people actually building renewable energy and this sort of thing, is there room in mainstream journalism for reinforcing basic education over and over again? Because I feel like in a lot of stories, there's global warming, there's climate change, there's no paragraph that says, by the way, climate change, if you've forgotten, is caused by this, and stuff like that. So does AP have a sidebar ready to go for every, Seth Borenstein story that gets printed in a newspaper? Does NPR have what is global warming, that people can click on if they're checking out one of your stories online? And is that something that you think is possible to do for your outlets? And MNN, I think, has it all covered.
And then I think there was a hand in the last row right behind you. Yeah. And then we'll get that one, and then it'll be it. Okay.
Paul Mackey, Media Director at the World Resources Institute. My question is sort of about the role of green NGOs in this shifting media landscape. We have a website that frequently stories get picked up by the media, and those stories get plopped right down on those media websites. We have sharing content relationships with other media organizations. We're hiring more ex-journalists at our nonprofit. So with so many valuable, it sort of follows on the Greenpeace question. There are probably good stories about activists, but there are probably really good stories about actual climate scientists and other scientists out there. Where do they sort of fit in? There's so many brilliant people like that around in all these institutes in D.C. and around the world, and there are fewer and fewer mainstream media reporters. So are there any recommendations that you would all have for an environmental research group like WRI as it tries to fit into this media landscape?
Okay, and then we'll have a final question, and then give you guys.
My name's Sylvia Tognetti. I'm a consultant. I also write a blog called The Post-Normal Times, which addresses some of the what Jan referred to as the dissatisfaction with the current model. And my comment is that, I think science, and perhaps therefore also science journalism, is vulnerable because there's a reluctance to take a stand in policy, which, the public has an unrealistic expectation of science as providing certainty and black and white answers, and I don't think the public health profession has the same problem with taking a stand on policy. Public health is policy, and for some reason in the environmental field, scientists seem to separate themselves from policy and put themselves above it. And so I wonder if there isn't a role of journalists in helping to correct this image that we have of science, and if that might help.
Okay, well, if you didn't have enough to look at.
If I can start, first, if I could ask all of you, just ask you, could you please repeat your questions?
No.
I do want to address as many of these as possible very, very quickly. Glenn talked about people stories that is and always has been, regardless of whether you're talking about new media, old media, small J journalism, large J journalism. People stories, as originally famously framed, or it's attributed to Don Hewitt, the producer of 60 Minutes, the all-time most successful show of its kind, and one of the few that I still watch, said, if you don't have the person, you don't have the story. It's not always an easy goal, but it's always an admirable goal. So if you have people, send them to all of us. And it's something we need to be on the lookout for. And in her talk, of course, Elizabeth gave an example of talking about a regulatory decision by the Bush administration through the framework of somebody who's affected by it. And that is a tried and true model, and that's one of the things that isn't and should not change in terms of international coverage. Certainly, I don't really have any metrics on what's happening to overseas news organizations, but American news organizations have dramatically slashed their international coverage. CNN had a guy named Gary Stryker, who's an extraordinarily capable international environmental correspondent. He preceded me out the door by about 5 years. And one of the factors in covering international stories, particularly for a medium like television with moving camera crews and a contingent of several people around us, they're breathtakingly expensive to cover, and expense rules the day. So the news is not good there. We also have two representatives here from Hopkins and from the International Center for Journalists who can maybe shed some more light on that later if we have a chance to discuss this after we break up. And Sylvia's thing, I just want to take a quick minute to, this is one of my proudest moments looking back at my CNN career, where I got my bosses to sort of understand climate change by describing the process of science to them in a context that broadcast executives would understand. And that context, of course, was O.J. Simpson. And the way that we tend to look at complex science and environmental questions as a society is very, very similar, if you think about it, to the criminal standard of guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's a lot of discussion that goes on, and regardless of what the issue is, climate change is a very convenient example of sowing seeds of reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence. And by the standard of reasonable doubt, climate change could never be convicted in a criminal trial, and would therefore be free to go out and seek the real killer, if you can remember back to your O.J. history. And then if you take the standard of civil guilt, that is probably a much better model to consider questions of science, including climate change. And by that standard, climate change would owe the Goldman family a whole lot of money. And I explained this to my bosses, and I was so proud of myself. It was like I discovered fire. And it helped to foster a better understanding. It didn't necessarily help extensively to get more climate change reporting on the air, but it helped to put that in a context that many people could understand. But I've often held to that. When we look at these science questions, as Sylvia said, certainty is not the model. Reasonable doubt is not the standard. And whether that's a scientific debate or whether it's the next step when scientific debate goes into that train wreck of policy discussion, that's the way we have to view things. And that often plays, Oren brought this up before, into the bias question. But that's all a part of it. And that standard of preponderance of evidence is basically the functional rule that I carry for issues like climate change.
I just wanted to make a quick point about international stories about climate change. And this is a little plug for the internet and for NPR. The one thing that's great about the internet is that stories that used to disappear basically as soon as you wrapped your fish around the newspaper now can be found for a really long time. And stories about climate change probably don't have an endless shelf life, but lots of them have a pretty long shelf life. NPR did a year-long series on climate change, and reporters went to places, exotic places like Mali and Antarctica and all the heck over the place. And those stories are still available on the NPR website. And so it can be a teaching tool. Those are stories that are still alive and available. And that's just one example of I'm sure lots of other examples of really good reporting on issues of climate change that are still alive. And so if we don't have the money to send people to Mali this year because of the recession, that story will still be there. And I'm sure there are other examples of other organizations that have resources like that as well.
So if I can just go through, continuing on that, in terms of the international, 2 years ago, January 2007, before all, the bottom fell out on everything, when media was only sick, not, terminal ill, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the chief scientific organization, scientists around the world, met in Paris and then in Brussels a month later. AP sent me there. AP doesn't send reporters to much travel because if I want to go to Yellowstone, there's a reporter out there. Why do we have to spend money? We got a reporter out there. They sent me to Paris and then Brussels for this. When I was in January 2007, there were just three reporters based in the U.S. at the IPCC meeting. Myself, David Biello of Scientific American, and Kidda McPherson at the Newark Star-Ledger. Kidda is now doing public relations at Princeton, so basically only two of us are left. But there were many, many more media from Europe. Granted, it was a lot closer, a lot cheaper, but that also reflects the interest. Going to Aaron's point on the climate reinforcing what happens. I usually do have a paragraph of that, but I also usually write way more than my editor wants, and that's either the first thing to go when I self-edit or one of the first things to go to when my editor edits. Unfortunately, when you're trying to deal with breaking news and new stuff, almost the first thing to go is the old stuff. And it's a shame, but it's just the nature of the business. One thing that we have been talking about, and unfortunately not finishing, but you have given me a reminder, was a standing graphic explainer that would go. Now, I've been talking with a graphic person in New York about this for a while, and it was his idea, not mine. We just haven't gotten it done because everything else is happening. And finally, back there about activist scientists, there's really only, let me give you two words, James Hansen. I'm sorry, he's an activist scientist. You look at others. There's actually an issue in the scientific community about whether people like Hansen are, crossing the line from their end. So this is, nothing is black and white. There's this giant thing. So I don't think you can say that there aren't enough scientists out there. You have people who are staying within the science, but still saying, look, you have to look at this issue. You've got to pay attention. People like Steve Schneider and Terry Root at Stanford. And in terms of people stories, I guess the question is, with your limited resources, limited time, do you want to spend that on people, profiles, which are really good and important? Or do you want to spend it on the newer stories that are have broader reach? And unfortunately, if you have to make a choice, it's again sort of goes back to the whole paragraph or so about the old news. You have to make choices. My first editor, 30-some years ago, told me one of the keys is into good reporting and good writing is to kill your babies. The stuff that you're so wedded to, that's almost the first thing to go. And it's sad, but that's sort of the nature of the thing. Some of the stuff you think that's really most good, when you have to make priority changes, especially in a situation like this, it just happens. You have to not do it.
I'll just wrap by addressing the international reporting. There's a very interesting initiative launched last month, globalpost.com, that might be worth keeping your eye on, and they're really fielding foreign correspondents around the world and putting stories online. And then Global Voices Online, which is an initiative of Harvard's Berkman Center, that is doing wonderful work. They won our award for innovations in journalism 2 years ago. They curate and translate blogs from about 250, mostly third world countries, and they're now in partnership with Reuters to get the word out. So.
Well, thank you for a rich set of questions and obviously a rich discussion from up here. I think it's fair to say that this is not the last word, and hopefully not the last word here at the Wilson Center. So we look forward to providing additional fora for these kinds of discussions. As I mentioned, on February 26th, we'll have this session with from editors' perspective. We've heard a lot about the editors and them as gatekeepers and barriers to getting getting more coverage for some of these stories. So we'll hear how they went overseas, saw some of these stories, and are come back and hopefully changed some of their activities. I'd also should say, seeing Flo Stone in the audience, as I think the 8th or 9th year in a row, will host one of the films in the DC Environmental Film Festival, a very rich 2-week period in March where you can see so many of these stories on screen in ways that are tremendously compelling and educational. So we hope that you will check out the film festival and take advantage of that. Why don't you please join me in thanking our panelists today.